Picture this. You're a pilot on your last leg of the day. You're established on approach with all checklists complete when suddenly the calm cockpit atmosphere is shattered by a flat, urgent command. Traffic, traffic, descend, descend. That voice is coming from your aircraft's traffic collision avoidance system, or TCAS, which is a last resort safety net, and it has just told you that something you cannot see is on a collision course with your aircraft. So you don't debate it. You must follow the TCAS instruction. That's how this system works and how it has saved lives for decades now. But what if the plane that you were just told to avoid was never there in the first place? Unfortunately, this is no longer a purely theoretical question. Over the past 2 years, we've been hearing slight variations of exactly that story. Flight crews who have reported false traffic alerts, usually on approach relatively low down over the ground. And researchers working on certified test rigs in labs have shown that under controlled conditions you can make TCAS see either something that isn't there, or even worse, it could stay quiet when it should speak up. So what does this actually mean then? Is someone doing something deliberately with malicious intentions, or is it some kind of wild radio interference? Stay tuned. TCAS, or the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, has a very simple purpose. It works basically in 3 different levels, where the first one just shows the presence of aircraft in a predetermined bubble around your aircraft. In the second level, it makes us aware that we are now getting too close to another aircraft by giving us a warning about it. And in the third, if the situation isn't rectified quickly, TCAS will give us pilots very clear oral and visual instructions on how to avoid a potential collision. So basically, first it informs us, then it warns us, and lastly it tells us how to get to safety. Now, that first level is basically just showing us where other aircraft are on our navigational display. But it's in the second level where things get a bit interesting. The warning that we receive is then called a traffic advisory, or a TA, and it tells us that the aircraft is calculating that a potential collision is about 45 seconds away with a particular filled yellow circle. At lower altitudes during takeoff and landing, for example, this is often the only warning that TCAS will give us. And that's one of the reasons why airspace around airports is so tightly controlled. We are very dependent on air traffic control to provide separation there, and also, obviously, we're dependent on our own vigilance to keep us safe. But higher up, if the TCAS system then runs the projected paths of 2 planes and thinks this could lead to a collision within 25 seconds now, it produces something known as a resolution advisory, or an RA. That's that instruction that I mentioned before, which will be visually shown in the form of a red trapezoid on our primary flight display. It will also show a red diamond on the navigation display, indicating where the traffic is. And it also uses a number of different vertical oral instructions like climb, climb, descend, descend, or level off. Now, the procedures we follow when we receive a TCAS warning are treated very similar to the terrain pull-up warnings that we get from the ground proximity warning system. In the same way as there, we are trained to act on TCAS alerts immediately, before even talking to air traffic control. And on top of that, we are even trained to disregard instructions from air traffic control until the TCAS resolution advisory is resolved. As part of that procedure, we really only advise them on what we're doing during the procedure, like TCAS climb or TCAS descend, and if they give us any kind of instruction, we just tell them unable, TCAS climb or TCAS descend. Then, once we hopefully receive the clear of conflict message from TCAS, we will advise the controller of where we are, what happened, and ask for how to proceed. And the reason for that is that TCAS is, like I mentioned, considered a last layer of defense. So if a TCAS resolution advisory is issued, air traffic control has already failed for some reason, and it's more safe to trust the hardware in our aircraft than to hope that the controller has everything figured out. And that is worth remembering here. So, how does the TCAS system actually work then? Well, under the hood, TCAS depends on a pre-existing aircraft system called Mode C or Mode S transponders. These are little radio boxes that are sending out signals which can be picked up by a secondary radar installation as well as other aircraft around. Back in the day, older primary radar installations used to have to send out the signal and then wait for it to bounce off an aircraft and then return back to it in order to determine a position. But secondary radar instead receives a position signal from our transponder, which also contains a lot more information, like our aircraft type, our altitude, flight number, and even more stuff depending on whether we have a Mode C or a Mode S transponder installed. TCAS also uses our transponder and then actively interrogates other transponders on nearby aircraft, building a picture from those returns on how the airspace looks around us. By the way, this same transponder system also underpins ADS-B, which lets you look up at the planes flying directly overhead you with the help of apps like Flight Radar 24, for example. Now, what makes TCAS really clever is that dialogue that happens between the transponders of different aircraft. When two TCAS-equipped aircraft are on a collision course, the systems then start to coordinate over the transponder data link, figuring out what the best course of action would be in order to avoid the collision. That means that the crew in one aircraft will be told to climb, while the other will be told to descend. And that guidance is then complementary all the way through the entire maneuver. That automatic back and forth communication is what separates TCAS from other similar systems that we have on board, like the ground proximity warning system, for example. It keeps the aircraft away from the ground using its own sensors and a built-in terrain database, but it doesn't communicate with anyone, whilst TCAS keeps both aircraft away from each other cooperatively, and that's important to also remember. Now, the TCAS system has also evolved over time. For example, the logic and phrasing of TCAS advisories have been tuned to make the instructions clearer and easier for pilots to understand. And nuisance alerts have also been trimmed out to make sure that crews are conditioned to not ignore the system. Now, what actually happens inside of the cockpit when a TCAS resolution advisory activates can vary a little bit depending on the aircraft involved. On some newer Airbus models, for example, the autopilot will fly the resolution advisory automatically if the aircraft is on autopilot and under some additional conditions. But in older Airbus models, and at least as far as I know on all Boeings, the pilots have to fly the resolution advisory manually, just like they do with a terrain escape maneuver. This is really important to understand because there have been some scary headlines in the press lately saying things like spoofed radio signals make an airliner dive. But those reports skip quite a few steps here, since again, even in aircraft where the system is more automated, the pilots do still have full control and the last say. But at the same time, we are trained to trust TCAS and to react to its calls immediately when a resolution advisory comes, since at least in theory, by the time that we get that message, the systems in both aircraft have already started talking to each other, comparing their positions and speed, and have decided on their plan. So if the crew on one aircraft disregard this warning, or even worse, if they do the opposite to what the aircraft says, things could get much, much worse. And we have unfortunately already seen that in the tragic Überlingen disaster, which was the real precursor to these rules. So what has changed? Why is there suddenly a problem? Well, I'll get back to that in a minute, but before I do, one thing that my team and I have noticed, especially when researching stories like hacking, is that it is very easy to end up on websites that maybe doesn't look dangerous at a first glance, but could easily be hiding malware, trackers or phishing traps. And those sites are getting harder and harder to spot. That's where today's sponsor NordVPN comes in, and especially their feature called Threat Protection Pro. This isn't just about hiding your location or bypassing geo-blocks. Instead, it's a serious cybersecurity tool that proactively scans websites you're visiting before they even load, and then blocks whatever security threats that it detects. What I really like is that this works even when I'm not connected to a VPN, so my browsing is always protected. And when you consider just how many phishing attempts and scams that are out there nowadays, having something that blocks up to 90% of them is a big deal. Right now, you can try this for yourself with 4 extra months for free when you sign up for the 2-year plan at nordvpn.com/mentor. or by scanning this QR code. And remember, Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't risk anything by trying. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to what's happening with TCAS. Recently, two sets of events have brought TCAS into the spotlight, and not in a good way. The first one happened to several aircraft flying in the real world, and interestingly, the other happened in a lab. So this all basically started in March of this year with a scare at the Reagan-Washington National Airport, which rattled quite a few people in the aviation industry. As I'm sure that many of you know, this was the same airport where just weeks earlier a mid-air collision between an airliner and a US Army helicopter marked the first fatal aircraft accident by a US airline in over a decade. That happened in January, but in March, multiple jets on the river visual approach to runway 19 suddenly started reporting erroneous TCAS traffic advisories and even resolution advisories within just minutes of each other. And understandably, the crews on several of those aircraft then broke off their approaches. These false alarms with no matching traffic around obviously raised a lot of eyebrows, because this wasn't just unusual, it was practically unheard of.
Multiple commercial aircraft.
A few weeks later, at a hearing by the American Congress, the culprit was revealed. It turns out that the US Secret Service and the US Navy had been conducting anti-drone testing at a site very close to the airport. And during that exercise, they had filled the TCAS radio spectrum with noise. FAA Administrator Chris Rochelot confirmed that these tests had been conducted, even though the FAA had warned about the potential consequences of them. Now, some initial press reports indicated that at least a dozen flights were impacted, but later reports then reduced this down to 6, all happening within just 11 minutes during that morning. So the bottom line here is that this wasn't a hacker campaign. Instead, it was just a really poorly chosen location for tests like that, and it obviously still rattled the unexpected crews, especially given the airport and the timing involved. But what about those other lab events then? Well, these were tests performed by so-called white hat hackers. That's people who work for universities, system designers and aircraft makers, and their job is to poke and prod at systems to look for vulnerabilities and loopholes so that whatever weaknesses they find can be dealt with before malicious hackers or black hats find it and can start causing harm. In the lab, these research teams, who had been working with actual certified TCAS hardware under tightly controlled conditions, showed that they could remotely push the TCAS system into two kinds of very bad behavior. They could either trick the system into displaying a phantom intruder, basically another aircraft when nothing was really there. Or, in other cases, when the hackers tested on some older interface setups, they could cause a plane's TCAS to not escalate from a traffic to a resolution advisory when it should, which is truly terrifying. Now, no live traffic was involved in this testing, and crucially, the teams didn't make public any sensitive details on how they achieved their results, but they obviously shared it with the industry. Now, these teams simply wanted to demonstrate that even a safety-first radio design like this can still be confused if you just prod it in just the wrong way. And that, along with the real-world events over Washington in March, is exactly the sort of pattern that can erode trust, which is literally the last thing that we want when it comes to TCAS. Now again, these events involved testing, and so far it's just been a bit of a mess, not any malice involved. So put together, the story is not that someone is hacking airliners, at least not yet, but it clearly shows that the system has more vulnerabilities than we maybe thought. So that's why airlines and academics are now treating this as a real operational issue, not just a curiosity. And it's also why researchers and cybersecurity experts are now really pushing the issue and trying to keep pressure on the regulators and plane makers to take swift action. And I couldn't agree more with them doing that, because this is frankly terrifying, and the last thing that we need is the kind of problems that we're now seeing with GPS jamming and spoofing, but with the TCAS system instead. When I first saw the press conference or the YouTube link, which I will link to by the way here, from those white hackers, it really scared me. And I actually talked about it on the podcast that Ben and I do, Captain Speaking, where we discussed the further implications of this. But again, all research on this has been kept under tight control. But luckily, there is also some encouraging information. Basically, it turns out that this would be very hard to do without very specific knowledge and equipment. And it would also likely be hard to hide it from people that are looking for it. To influence what a specific airplane sees at a specific moment, you would need to be quite close by, have the right timing and transmitting equipment with a certain amount of power. And you would likely also need to do all of this inside of controlled airspace, where a lot of people are watching and where various government agencies and ministries take interference very seriously. So this is likely not something that an amateur hacker is likely to attempt just for fun, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. Interference like that, which caused the events at Washington National, is still a potential problem, especially if the military starts using it against drones. And it is worth keeping in mind that to a crew operating in busy airspace, a spurious descent on approach would look exactly the same as a real one. So those pilots would get the startle effect during a time when there's already a high workload present, and a sudden TCAS maneuver obviously then causes an unplanned vertical deviation, which could sow further confusion and mistakes both for the pilots and for air traffic control. So that means that even if everyone would perform perfectly in a scenario like that, it would still cause an unnecessary risk to the aircraft involved. Now, of course, in my mind, the worst thing here is that a little bit of trust in the system is lost, which I'll get back to later. But for now, just remember that TCAS works as well as it does because pilots know to follow it instantaneously, basically without even thinking. But things can look less certain when we flip the coin and look at the opposite scenario which those white hackers managed to produce. If the interference would stop TCAS from sending out a warning about a conflict that is actually real. Again, this was something that was demonstrated as possible, but only with older legacy aviation equipment. Of course, for something like that to happen with the malicious intent, whoever is doing it would first need to arrange an actual conflict between two planes, which, again, likely isn't something that a rogue hacker or a terrorist cell would be able to do, but still not good. So having said all of that, let's now instead look at the different layers of protection that we do have and how they can still protect us even if TCAS would start acting up. And it is probably worth mentioning here that the passengers and crews involved in the spurious TCAS events in March all landed safely. The first reason that TCAS is so difficult to hack is because, as I already said, it involves not one, but two different transponders in two different aircraft. As I explained, those systems then look at a lot of data like closure rates and vertical separation, and they do so multiple times before coordinating their commands to each flight crew. It is also a reactive system, meaning that it will monitor how each plane behaves after the resolution advisory is given, and if one aircraft is unresponsive, it will change or even reverse its command to the other aircraft in order to still keep them apart. This means that even if one aircraft is hacked, the system would likely still work as long as the other system is not, and that the signals being sent out from the hacked aircraft is not corrupted in some way. Also, like I mentioned in the beginning, near the ground, TCAS gets a bit more conservative, meaning that it has some additional limitations. Once an aircraft is on approach and it descends below a certain altitude, usually around 1,000 feet, TCAS will only issue traffic advisories, not resolution advisories. The reason for that is obviously to reduce distractions and avoid pitch-down commands close to the ground. Those limitations should still be in place, even with a hacker attack, which would make it a little bit less dangerous, I guess. After that, we have the crew discipline and clear procedures used. You see, aircraft are always spread out with both vertical and horizontal separation, so traffic conflicts are exceedingly rare as it is. And if we pilots would encounter a sudden resolution advisory, we're supposed to fly it, inform ATC and use standard callouts to keep both pilots in the loop. We will then keep the maneuver tight by gently following the pitch commands on our primary flight display, and only once the conflict is clear will we level off, brief ATC about the nature of the maneuver, possibly connect our automatics again and then plan for our next move. So This is not a sudden or violent maneuver at all. It just has to be executed promptly and accurately, meaning that even if it is spurious, it shouldn't lead to any danger by itself. On top of that, as the incidents over Washington in March clearly showed, air traffic control can then add another buffer. If multiple flights start calling in odd traffic advisories or executing resolution advisories, controllers can broadcast cautions to all other incoming and departing flights, letting them know what is happening. And air traffic control can then also, of course, slow the flow down, add extra spacing, and even stop approaches altogether if a threat is identified. So, common sense and situational awareness are obviously their own safety buffer here. And then, of course, we have other protections that will still be working. Close to the ground, the ground proximity warning system will keep us away from the ground regardless of whatever drama is affecting the transponders and TCAS. And it will take priority over TCAS if a terrain separation issue becomes present. In the tower, the controllers have their own completely separate conflict alert tools, providing a radar-backed sanity check if something weird would start to happen. And again, this is just adding to the safety layers that were already in place. Now I'm listing all of these systems to show you that TCAS is just one part of the much bigger systems, keeping planes apart and keeping everyone safe. So even serious hazards to TCAS doesn't necessarily put passengers in any actual danger. But the question still becomes, what is being done to fix this? Well, the short answer is, it's a mix of smarter transponders, sharper procedures, and a lot of smart people applying their brains to solve the problem. On the tech side, the big change is that the entire system is soon moving away from TCAS towards something called ACAS, or the Airborne Collision Avoidance System. Now, this isn't just a newer standard. It is actually the next generation of anti-collision systems that will replace TCAS. It features smarter decision logic, cleaner interfaces, and a better way to handle weird edge cases. So it has the very same mission that TCAS did, but the better underlying tech means added ruggedness and hopefully means to stop all of this. But even for existing equipment in the aircraft that we fly today, avionics vendors are now pushing software updates that should make existing transponders harder to rattle. A key here is making the track validation of each aircraft stronger and add filters to identify and ignore tracks that are implausible. All of this is part of a broader push for bigger architectural changes in aircraft communications that, for example, might let the system verify who is actually talking on the frequency and prioritize them appropriately, which is really tricky to do without breaking compatibility with older systems, and that's a subject for its own video, I think. The point here, though, is that there are steps being taken to add security to the system. It just has to be verified to not create any additional issues before it's fully deployed. Next, there are actions that the airlines are taking on the pilot training side to come up with procedures on what to do if a region starts throwing out odd TCAS alerts. Some training departments are apparently starting to train crews in what a spurious traffic advisory or an unexpected resolution advisory feels like in the simulator, and then practice their responses safely. But I haven't seen what that training looks like, and I would be very interested in learning more about that, because the last thing that we need is ambiguity around how a TCAS warning should be interpreted. There's obviously also another few entities that should matter here, like the governments and the regulatory bodies, who have to make sure that this gets the attention and priority that it deserves, and that the radio bands used for TCAS is not used by anyone else under any circumstance, at least not near airports or aviation infrastructure. Finally, we have the research community, the ones that actually brought this issue to the public attention in the first place, and they now need to work with all of the stakeholders that I just mentioned to try and patch the holes and eradicate this issue. But in the near term, it is likely all about procedures, training, and good reporting. If you are a pilot out there and you come across something like this, treat it seriously and make sure that you report it. But having said all of this, I have to say that I find it highly annoying that in the constantly ongoing fight for better aviation safety, we first had to deal with GPS jamming and spoofing, and now potentially this. So what do you think? Had you ever heard about this issue before, and how do you think that it should be addressed? Let us know in the comments here below, and please leave a like and a subscription to the channel if you think that it's worth it. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.